One of the greatest fortunes we have with the precious human life is having a human mind whereby we can think about things instead of just react, where we can have a sense of moral judgment or ethical discrimination, however you want to say it, where we can consider the welfare of others and the disadvantages of our self-centeredness, to have a human mind that can think about the nature of reality. Sometimes you look at our kitties and they're so cute, but if you look in their eyes, it's like there's a person in there, but the brain won't let them think and understand and learn because of the limits of having that rebirth, that kind of body. And so for this short period of time with a human body and a human mind, we have great possibilities as well as great fortune. So it's important that we really treasure this opportunity and make good use of it. And of course, one of the best ways to do that is to think of the faults of our self-centeredness, the benefits of cherishing others, and really train ourselves in that. No matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult it is, because it's something noble and worthy of a human mind to do, something valuable for ourselves and others that will lead to meaning and purpose and benefit for everybody. So with that kind of intention, then we'll learn about the ethical conduct of the Bodhisattvas. So you can kind of see with the Bodhisattva precepts that you can understand why you can study those without having taken them, whereas with the monastic precepts in general, at least in the Tibetan tradition, you're not supposed to study them before you've taken them, And you can see kind of why, because the Bodhisattva precepts are really talking about how to be a good human being and, do something with our self-centeredness and open our hearts to others, And the monastic precepts are teaching the same thing, but there's a lot more detail there that corresponds just to the monastic way of life. That doesn't necessarily concern people who don't have that way of life. Yeah, so you can see there's some kind of difference there. Okay? So, we are still on the precepts that have to do with practicing the far-reaching meditative stabilization. Yeah, so we just finished talking about not learning and practicing the antidotes to distraction. And then number 26 is relishing the pleasant sensation of concentration. Okay, so when you've overcome all the hindrances, then your next hindrance is that you get attached to how good you feel when, the mind's fully concentrated. So this misdeed is known as a, quote, quote, subsequent fault, because it implies having achieved meditative serenity, which gives rise to intense pleasure induced by the attainment of physical and mental pliancy. Okay, so after, when you've done the 9 levels of sustained attention, then after that you have to develop physical and mental pliancy, which lead to developing mental and physical bliss. And then after that you attain serenity. And that, the serenity is actually just the access, the preceding stage to the first jhana, or the first meditative stabilization. So a serenity is really praised a lot. You're not quite at even the first meditative stabilization, but it's still quite good. And you can use that access concentration to do a lot of good things, in your mind. Okay, so the fault consists of craving the pleasurable feelings that occur in meditation and considering them to be goals unto themselves. Okay, so you've attained serenity, or you've attained one of the jhanas, and instead of seeing it as a concentrated state of mind that you can apply to meditate on all the other stages of the path, you see the concentration itself as a goal in itself, and you become quite attached to how pleasurable it feels to be in that single-pointed state. Okay? And that's a hindrance, because when you have that attachment, then you just stay in the single-pointedness, but you don't necessarily meditate on bodhicitta or renunciation or wisdom. You just kind of enjoying your single-pointed bliss, but you're not using it for a really good purpose. Okay? It's like having $1 million and then, you just sit there in your own house enjoying the $1 million without doing something, really good with it. Yeah, and some people even, because the practice of serenity and also the meditative stabilizations are not a specifically Buddhist practice, then many non-Buddhists can actualize them, and some of them even mistake it for liberation. Especially as you get into the higher meditative absorptions, and so sometimes people think, "Oh, I'm liberated." And whereas they haven't developed wisdom at all, and then when that level of absorption ends, then they kind of freak out. Yeah. Or what they do is they stay immersed in that, and by doing so create what's called the immovable karma, which is when we study the 12 links, we come across that. So if you've attained, let's say, the first jhana, and you just stay in that, then you create the karma to be born in the first jhana in your next life. When you're a human being, you have a human body, but your mind can be in the first jhana. But then after you die, you create because of that, you create the cause to have a body and mind, where you're an actual form realm being of the first jhana. Okay, I'm translating jhana as meditative stabilization. Dhyana is the Sanskrit word. Zen is the Chinese word, the Japanese word, and Shan is the Chinese word. Okay. So non-Buddhists can have that happen, and then it's a big shock. Either like, oh, I'm not liberated. Or, and oh, there's the lower realm, or getting born in one of those states, and then you stay in that for a very, very long time, and then at the end you come out of it, and you're born again in the desire realm, and so you've had a nice kind of vacation in the upper 2 realms, but you haven't really accomplished anything by it. Okay, and so this is why our teachers really emphasize the importance of developing renunciation and bodhicitta and the correct view of emptiness, so that we always have that in mind as we cultivate concentration, and we don't get kind of like, oh, that feels so good, and just want to do concentration meditation. Okay?
When a person is born in that realm, are they burning up their merit then?
Okay, so if a person is born in that, let's say the first jhana or second jhana, are they burning up the merit? Well, they've created that karma when they were in the desire realm as a human being. And then when that karma, and then they're born there, and then when that karma ceases, then they fall out of that realm.
They're not accumulating merit.
In the form realm, the formless realm, definitely you're not accumulating merit, because you're just, so in your, in the formless realm, I mean, you're definitely not accumulating merit. In the form realm, I think sometimes they can, because you hear stories of certain devas, or Brahma, Saka, different gods in these realms, who will come and listen to the Buddha's teachings. Yeah. So, some of those devas in certain realms may meet the Dharma and have faith in the Dharma. Yeah. But still, it's said that a precious human life is better. Yeah? Because we have a balance of suffering and happiness, whereas they don't have a lot of suffering. So when you don't have a lot of suffering, you often don't have the oomph to practice the Dharma. You just kind of get complacent. Whereas, we have more suffering in the human realm, so it keeps us on our toes a bit more. Mm-hmm. Okay, of the 4 afflictions that prevent us from maintaining and furthering the quality of our states of concentration, the first is attachment to the joys, the joy that they produce. So, attachment to, they call this, when you study in the Abbey Dharma the different kinds of attachment, there's one that is attachment to the being born in the 2 upper realms. Yeah? So there's, desire realm attachment, because we desire all these desirable objects, but then there's attachment to being born in the form realm and in the formless realm too. But it's still something to be eliminated, because those are still states within samsara. Okay? Although it does happen that, let's say, on the here and solitary realizer path, as you're progressing, you may take rebirth in the form realm for certain lifetimes and be able to continue practicing. But you've done that after you have first realized emptiness. So you're not going to get stuck just in the meditative bliss. Okay? So the first is the attachment to the joy of the concentration. The second is pride, such as the inflated feeling that we are far superior to those who have not gained similar experiences. Okay, so this is a big danger if you attain states of concentration, that you get kind of arrogant, look what I've done, and I'm a better meditator than you, and, I've accomplished this and that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The third is ignorance, such as mistaking the high state of concentration that we have achieved for liberation from samsara. So that's what I was saying before. And the fourth is holding wrong views, because you can be born or have actualized in a human body those states and still hold many, many wrong views. Yeah, because remember when the Buddha first renounced, and he went to 2 other teachers before he went under the Bodhi tree. Well, those 2 teachers were teaching him the form and formless realm absorptions. Yeah, and he accomplished all of those, but he realized he still hadn't overcome the ignorance and the wrong views. Yeah, and so that's why then he tried doing the ascetic trip and found out that didn't work. Okay, so he experimented doing a few different things that didn't work, yeah, before he crossed the river and then went and sat under the Bodhi tree. Okay. Giving in to any of these disturbing factors in concentration is a misdeed associated with afflictions, because clearly, attachment, pride, ignorance, wrong views those are afflictions. However, when we try and counter negative responses such as attachment to the pleasure experienced in meditation, even if we do not immediately succeed, we do not commit a secondary misdeed. So it's in the others, when we have attachment to desire realm things or anger, as long as we're trying to overcome it, we haven't committed a transgression. Although it's not karma-free. Okay? So that wraps up the section that has to do with attaining meditative stability. And now we're moving into the section of the precepts, the 8 misdeeds contrary to far-reaching wisdom. Okay, so number 27, Chandragoman said, rejecting the hearer vehicle. So he translates it here as listener vehicle, often it's hearer vehicle. What's very interesting, the term is Shravaka, okay, which is the same root as Sravasti, yeah. But Shravaka, it can mean to hear or to listen to. And the Tibetans say that they're called hearers or listeners because they listen to the Buddha's teaching, and then they, they can explain the teachings to others. And also when they have attained nirvana, then they cause others to hear that when they say, I've accomplished what there has been to accomplish, and the holy life has been fulfilled, and this is my last rebirth. So that's why they're called hearers. But actually, at the time of the Buddha, the word Shravaka was a term that was in common use even amongst non-Buddhists, because there were so many different spiritual teachers, and all those spiritual teachers had disciples who listened to their teachings. Yeah, so every teacher had his own Shravakas. So sometimes it's translated as disciples, and thus the disciple vehicle. Okay, so that's why. Now, like in the Theravada, they don't say hearers, they usually say disciples. Yeah, they translate it that way. Okay, so rejecting that vehicle. The first 4 misdeeds that conflict with the practice of wisdom, this is the first one, are committed in relation to a lesser object. Okay, here we're getting into, the Mahayana, Hinayana terminology, which I will give you my take on. The first consists, why don't I just talk about that now? Because you find in the Mahayana teachings, it's very interesting, from the Tibetan viewpoint, the Buddha taught the Mahayana also during his lifetime, but in a different form, and so it wasn't prevalently known in society during that time. If you go to Vulture's Peak, it's a small place. You can't fit all those people in there that on the heart, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra says actually came, a great assembly of bodhisattvas, and it's a kind of small place. So they say that the Buddha taught there, but then the teachings weren't prevalent in our human world. And then later on, when people's minds had become more receptive to that kind of teaching, then the teaching became more popular. So at the beginning, when you first find the Mahayana scriptures becoming more popular, they were just talking about one way of practice amongst many ways of practice. Okay? And then as time went on, instead of just being a way of practice, the word Mahayana came to mean a set of scriptures. And then as time went on after that, Mahayana came to mean a whole school. Yeah, so there was a development in the meaning of the word Mahayana. And so in the early Mahayana, the Mahayana sutras that became popular in the earlier, you don't find the word Hinayana. And you don't find this kind of, you don't find the word Hinayana, yeah. As you come to the Mahayana sutras that became popular later on, that's where you find the word Hinayana, and you'll even find in some of the sutras the arhats, really the difference between the arhats and the Buddha being very, very clear and distinct. That the arhats lack certain qualities that a fully enlightened Buddha had. Okay? So then this terminology of Hinayana and Mahayana got passed down. So Hinayana, literally translated, means like lesser vehicle, and Mahayana is greater vehicle. His Holiness realizes that terminology is highly offensive to our Theravada brothers and sisters, and so he often says fundamental vehicle instead of Hinayana, which I think is definitely a step in the right direction. Although one of my Theravada monk friends pointed out to me that, calling it fundamental vehicle also to him was a little bit offensive, because that made it seem like, well, this is just the basic vehicle, not like it was a respectable path in its own right. So the terminology is a little bit difficult. What Samdang Rinpoche suggested, because I wrote him about this, regarding the writing I'm doing, and he suggested, well, maybe just use the term Shravakayana, which is very clear, the people who are following the Shravaka path, and then Bodhisattvayana, the people who are following the Bodhisattva path. So in some ways that seems to be a little bit clearer. And then, it's people's decision what path they want to follow. But there aren't these kind of value or pejorative words, yeah? So I think it's very important, especially because we go to monastic conferences and other gatherings with people from other Buddhist traditions, that we absolutely do not use the term Hinayana, okay? Because it's really very offensive, and in a way, if you want to talk about the motivation for becoming an arhat, and compare it to the motivation for becoming a Buddha, you can draw differences between that, but to criticize somebody is a whole different ballgame, I think, or to appear arrogant in terms of the tradition that we follow, I think is not conducive to the kind of harmony that the Buddha would like to see amongst his disciples. Yeah. So, and you'll hear it all the time when you go to teachings by Tibetan teachers, the word tekmen in Tibetan, and then the translators say Hinayana, and nobody thinks twice until somebody from that tradition is there listening to the teaching, and then they just get really offended, which is really a pity, because there's so much in the Mahayana teachings, in the Bodhisattvayana, that is so beautiful, but they're turned off from listening to it just by being offended at the language. Yeah. Okay. So the first of these precepts consists of thinking that as a follower of the great vehicle, that's the Mahayana, we have no need to listen to teachings of the listener or solitary realizer vehicles. It is the belief that studying them or training in them is unnecessary, and the expression of that opinion, holding this view and voicing it, constitutes a secondary misdeed associated with afflictions. So right there, associated with afflictions, when you're saying it's not necessary as a bodhisattva practitioner to study and practice and learn the trainings of the Shravakayana. Okay? Now, I must say, there's a lot of people who hold that view. I've met a lot of people in the Mahayana tradition who just kind of dismiss, well, it's a lower vehicle, we don't need to learn it. But actually, when, they say that because they don't understand things very well, because so much of what is in the Lam Rim is straight out of the Pali Canon, okay? It may not have been translated from Pali, it may have been translated from some of the early sutras in one of the other, Indo-Arya languages, but the meaning is the exact same thing, yeah? So, even like the whole example in the Precious Human Life with the turtle, straight out of the, Pali Sutras. So much, and teachings about renunciation, many, many things. And so to say that we don't need to learn those teachings or practice them is really ridiculous. Yeah, because how are we going to generate renunciation? And if we can't generate renunciation, then we can't generate bodhicitta. Yeah, because bodhicitta is, not just renunciation for ourselves, but renunciation for everybody. So we have to train in those. And His Holiness once said, we were talking about the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. This is one of the basic practices that's taught in the disciples' vehicle. And he said he feels that a lot of people in the Tibetan tradition miss out because they don't really do that practice. Yeah, and it's quite, we did the whole 4 mindfulnesses, didn't we? It took us quite a while to go through that. You can see there's a lot in that practice, isn't there? It's very, very rich. And we talked about how a bodhisattva practices it and how a person who's a Sravaka practices it. So there's some difference there, but still within so much of the basic practice, it's the same, okay? So, and if you look in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, they all go through the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, which include the 4 establishments of mindfulness. Okay, so and it's quite interesting, really, when you read, like the Sutra of the 10 Grounds, which is one of the Mahayana sutras. Some of it, they talk about the 37 harmonies. And it's almost the exact same wording as in the early sutras. Yeah, but there it is, right, smack in the middle of the Sutra of the 10 Grounds, which is one of the, a very popular Mahayana sutra. Yeah, and when you study the Ornament of Clear Realizations, Abhisamaya Alankara, it goes through that whole practice too of the 37 harmonies. So it's, quite important to learn those things. So it's important for 2 reasons. One is that part of it forms what we ourselves need to practice for our own spiritual advancement. And the second reason is that if we want to become Buddhas, it's so that we can really help others and teach others according to their disposition and their interest, which means we have to know all the different things that the Buddha taught, because we're going to meet people who want to practice that kind of teaching. And so we have to know it in order to teach it to them, and not just know it intellectually, but know it through our own practice. Okay? Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't want to bother with the Sravaka vehicle, where would you start?
Well, some people might just start with bodhicitta, with one of the Mahayana, like with the Lotus Sutra or something like that. And, just study that, go think, I'm generating bodhicitta, and go on from there.
So the initial and middle scope are pretty much
Yeah.
left out.
Yeah. Well, see, this is one of the beauties in the way Lama Atisha and Jay Rinpoche after him arranged the topics in that order. This was a way of arranging all the different teachings that happened later. So some traditions, they may be centered around a particular sutra, And so they really just study mainly that sutra, maybe a little bit of other stuff from other sutras. Okay? And so they may not get this whole progression of how you take all these different themes and put them into a system that is for one individual's practice. Because remember, that's one of the strong points of the Lamrim, is that it shows how all the teachings of the Buddha can fit together into a path for one individual. Yeah. So I think, when you really learn, that's very special. And sometimes since we've learned it from the beginning, we take it for granted. But if you walked in and maybe the first sutra you learned was the Lotus Sutra, and that's what most of the people around you taught and practiced, then you would have a whole different view of things.
And the Lotus Sutra is mostly about Bodhisattva?
Well, it's a Mahayana sutra, and it talks some about bodhicitta, but it talks a lot about how skillful the Buddha is in leading disciples of different mentalities. But one of the big things is, the Shravaka vehicle is lower. Yeah. It makes that a strong point in it. Yeah. So,
what does that mean, lower?
Lower in the sense, if you follow the Shravaka vehicle, your aim is to become an arhat, not to become a Buddha. Okay? So that's the difference in motivation, between aspiring for your own liberation versus aspiring for full enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. Okay? And so you can see in the Lamrim, our first motivation is just to get a good rebirth, then to aspire for liberation, then finally bodhicitta. Yeah, but that's like that's such a skillful way of leading people and showing how all the teachings can be set to form a path that makes a lot of sense. But not all the traditions have the Lamrim in that way. Okay? So we're kind of fortunate. Hmm? Oh, okay. Yes. Exceptionally fortunate. Okay. We need to be careful because some followers of the Mahayana tend to neglect the hearer vehicle teachings and imagine that there is no need to study, contemplate, and meditate on them. Okay? It's true. Many people think that. This is a grave error, for followers of the Mahayana need to master all aspects of the Buddha's teachings, including those of the hearer and solitary realizer vehicles, so as to be ready to use them to help the living beings to whom they are most suited. For the sake of others, they must master these teachings even more thoroughly than someone who practices them exclusively. But even for our own benefit, on our own path, you can see the value of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. It's quite incredible, and it's there in the middle, the middle capacity being of the Lamrim. It's just usually they don't explain it a lot. They just teach it and then go on, but they don't really necessarily explain how to meditate on it. Although Jetsun Chukyi Gyaltsen wrote a very beautiful commentary, that was one of the things I used when I was explaining it. And I've heard other people say that actually as a Mahayana practitioner, we should practice everything in the Shravaka vehicle except the idea of attaining liberation for our own sake. But everything else we should practice and actualize for our own path. Okay? But just not the motivation of renunciation for our own sake. Okay. The only occasion on which we should ever express the above opinion is when we are dealing with practitioners of the Bodhisattva path who are tempted to abandon the great vehicle in favor of the hearer vehicle. To dissuade them, we may say that followers of the great vehicle do not need to study the teachings of the hearer vehicle. Okay, so in a thing of skillful means to stop somebody who, who may give up their their familiarization with bodhicitta, then you might say that. But I don't think that would come very often. Okay, then number 28 is, while you have your own tradition, devoting yourself to this, meaning the here vehicle. Okay, so while you're a Mahayana practitioner, devoting yourself to the here vehicle, or the disciple vehicle. So the second misdeed, contrary to the to far-reaching wisdom, is devoting oneself exclusively to this. In other words, to the here vehicle teachings. While we have the perfect opportunity to study the Mahayana scriptures, if we give it up entirely in favor of studying the here vehicle teachings, we commit a misdeed associated with afflictions. The idea is that as a follower of the Mahayana, we should give priority to studying, contemplating, and meditating on its scriptures, and the study of the works of other vehicles should come after. On the other hand, there is no fault in studying the scriptures of the here vehicle parallel to pursuing our efforts in the Mahayana. I think if you look at the Lam Rim, it has you definitely practicing the here vehicle before you get to the Mahayana vehicle. If you take the Lam Rim as something that you do one step at a time without knowing anything about the further steps, okay? But usually in the Lam Rim, we're encouraged to know all of the steps and the whole broad picture, okay? And then with that broad understanding, we might go back and, reflection on precious human life, on death, the four, establishments of mindfulness and so on. But you're reflecting on all of those with a bodhicitta motivation. So even though those topics came from the here vehicle, when you're doing your meditation and the whole context in which you take that topic is automatically getting put into a bodhisattva perspective. Okay? So, for example, you can meditate on precious human life, on just being, my precious human life. Or you can think of, look at all, may other beings have precious human lives, and care about other beings who have precious human lives, and want them, to be able to really learn the teachings in a deep way. Okay? Similarly, with taking refuge, you can take refuge as in the disciple vehicle way, where you have concern about your own lower rebirth and faith in the Buddha, or you can take refuge in a Mahayana way, where you, in addition to those two, have compassion for other sentient beings, and you're following the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, so that they can lead you to Buddhahood, so that you can be of greatest benefit to others. Okay? So the idea is when we're practicing the Lam Rim, by knowing the whole big picture, then even though we may start at the beginning, we're bringing in the bodhisattva perspective all along. Yeah?
This is a big point. If you don't know this one, that you have to study the chapter path, that is bodhicitta motivation. If you don't know this, then you can neglect it. So because you think this is not necessary.
Right, yeah. You just say it's not necessary, and I'll just do the 6 far-reaching practices, and no need for the rest. But the rest, Now, to what extent somebody needs to practice one thing or another, that's a different ballgame, yeah? But definitely we should be familiar with all these teachings. Okay, so like that I told you before, we want to know and practice everything except the motivation for our own enlightenment alone. Yeah, okay. Now, the thing is with this, when you study the the vehicles that are explaining principally, or the scriptures that are explaining principally the Shravaka vehicle path, the way the path and stages is set out is a little bit different, you know, and the way, you know, some of the teachings on selflessness are a bit different, let's say in the Pali scriptures. So I think one of the things that they're trying to get us to see here is, you know, keep studying the Madhyamaka view, okay? So it's not just about the motivation, but it's also about the view. So they say when we're studying tenets that there's two ways in which you can be either fundamental vehicle or Mahayana vehicle. And here I have to use those two terms. So one is according to motivation, one is according to view. So according to motivation, you're a fundamental vehicle practitioner if you are aspiring for your own liberation. And you're a Mahayana practitioner if you're aspiring for Buddhahood, for the benefit of all beings. Okay, that we know. In terms of view, you know, from the Tibetan perspective that talks about the four schools, Vaibhasika, Sautantrika, Chittamadra, and Madhyamaka, then the first two schools, Vaibhasika and Sautantrika, are called fundamental vehicle schools according to the view, while the Chittamadra and Madhyamaka are called Mahayana schools according to the view. Okay? So you can see that you can be somebody who has the fundamental vehicle motivation, but practices the Mahayana view. Or you can be somebody with fundamental vehicle motivation who practices fundamental vehicle view. You can be somebody with a Mahayana motivation who practices fundamental vehicle view. Or you can be somebody with a Mahayana motivation who practices Mahayana view. Okay, so there's 4 points, you know, in there. Okay, so I think part of it is emphasizing to us that, you know, to not only in terms of motivation, but in terms of view. Yeah. Now, again, this is the whole thing, and we talked about this when Guy was here, is, you know, a lot of what's said in the early sutras was interpreted in a certain way by the early commentators. And Nagarjuna really protested against a lot of those interpretations. Yeah. And so, and then, you know, he set forth many things. But a lot of the terminology Nagarjuna used, a lot of the arguments he used, they're the same arguments found in the early sutras. Okay? So it's hard to know, you know, kind of, the Tibetans usually say, oh, well, there's a few places in the early sutras where they taught, you know, selflessness of phenomena. Actually, I think there's more than a few places, but you know, if it's usually interpreted in a certain way, okay, then Nagarjuna really protested against that way of interpreting things. Yeah, because like the argument that we use for refuting emptiness, the fact of something not being one or different, yeah, that same argument's in the Pali Canon. Yeah, Nagarjuna's is the first verse in the Karikas, you know, that things are not produced by self, other, both, or causelessly. That same argument is in the early sutras. It's not necessarily applied extensively. I found a place where it was talked about suffering and it talked about feelings in that way. But, you know, certainly you could extrapolate from there to other phenomena as well. Okay, so it's quite interesting. You know, this is kind of something that, you know, I'm just thinking about. But then other times you read it and you see how the Pali commentators interpreted things, and you can see, oh yeah, there's a difference here between how the Madhyamakas see things. But then, what a tradition says due to its its commentators and what the Buddha really meant in those sutras. Yeah. And that's why you have so many traditions and so many commentators. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even in the Madhyamaka, even in the Mahayana, different people will interpret different statements. The way the Chittamadra interpret things and the way the Madhyamaka will interpret the exact same statement in the sutra is different. Okay, so this particular precept has to do, that if you're, really want to practice in the Bodhisattva vehicle, but instead of studying it and practicing it, you're mostly, studying and practicing in the hearer vehicle, then you're transgressing that. Okay, for the obvious reason that, don't give up your bodhicitta. Yeah.
When people have a direct experience, say two people have a direct experience of the same thing, can again it be distorted in the way they explain it?
When you say two people have a direct experience of the same thing.
Like when we study all the Pali and all of that, how to use everything and all those things, but if people have direct experience of those experiences, what is explained, can we again have a false view?
Oh, once you've had, let's say, direct experience of emptiness, no, you're not going to have any wrong views or false views. Yeah. Because once you've had that direct experience, all your doubt is cut off, all your wrong, your wrong views.
You're never going to get out of it.
Yeah, right. Okay. Okay, then number 29. Chandra Goman says, applying yourself excessively to non-Buddhist treatises. So the first two had to do with kind of paying too much attention. Well, the first one is not paying any attention to the hearer vehicle. The second one is paying too much attention to it. This one is paying too much attention to, lost my bookmark. Thank you. Paying too much attention to non-Buddhist teachings, okay? So this fault is described as applying oneself exclusively to the Tripitaka. So the Tripitakas are the non-Buddhists, yeah? They're sometimes called forders, and I can't remember why they were called forders. Anybody remember? There's a reason, but I can't remember it. Okay? Here it says that they were promoters of certain extreme views of Hinduism. Actually, Hinduism didn't exist at the time of the Buddha. Hinduism came later. You had the Vedas at the time of the Buddha and other things, Upanishads, but you didn't really have Hinduism as we know it at the time of the Buddha. Okay, so applying oneself exclusively to the Tripitaka works. When we have the opportunity to study Buddhist scriptures and instead devote all of our energy to the works of Tripitakas and other non-Buddhists, it is a misdeed associated with afflictions. Okay? So think about why it's associated with afflictions. Well, there is no misdeed in doing this if we have an excellent memory and clear and sharp understanding, are quick to learn and do not easily forget what we have studied. For example, we need to read a text only once to grasp its meaning. So if that's the case, then studying these non-Buddhist scriptures is not a downfall because you already have such a good foundation in the Mahayana. Nor is there a misdeed if we already have a very good grip on Buddhist principles and firm convictions regarding them. For in this case, there is no danger of our deviating for them. But if we don't have firm conviction and we have doubt, not so good. We must not interpret this to mean that we cannot read non-Buddhist philosophy. On the contrary, we need to know as much as we can about other views. if only to better our understanding of people. We can and should study them, but not to the extent that we spend more time on them than on the Buddhist teachings. In fact, in a day, we should spend twice as long on Buddhist treatises than on non-Buddhist works. Okay? So what he's saying here is there's a middle way. You know, we should learn about other traditions so that we understand those people and how they think. Yeah? And then if we meet them and we're in the position of teaching them, we'll be able to skillfully, you know, lead them. Also, when we learn those views, sometimes we see it makes it more apparent our own wrong views that we're holding on to that we aren't really aware of, you know, because, oh, there it is, that you know, talking about God. Gee, you know, that feels kind of, you know, familiar and inspiring, and, you know, and you see that come up, and then you go, ooh, you know, this is my wrong view of thinking there's an independent creator. Yeah, so it's not just the Tritikas that have this, you know, me, I have it too. And so then you think of, well, how am I going to refute my own wrong view? Okay, but the danger is that if you don't know the Dharma very well and you don't have a lot of conviction in the Dharma, then if you read these non-Buddhist things and you start, you know, reading the Bible or something like that, and then all these old imprints surface, and it's like, oh, you know, it's so familiar and it feels so comfortable, and God who's going to protect me and save me, and you know, and then you just wind up following that tradition and give up your Buddhist studies, which would be a great loss, you know, if you're trying to get enlightenment, to you know, do some study of, let's say, the Madhyamaka teachings, and then completely give it up to you know, because you believe in an independent creator. That would be a real kind of tragedy. So that's why, you know, there's this precept of don't spend too much time studying those kinds of things. So by Tritikas, we don't need to think of just the non-Buddhist schools like the Samkhya or whatever in ancient India. We could think of Christianity, you know, Judaism, New Age stuff, even psychology. You know, there was a time in the development of Buddhism in the West. I think at the beginning a lot of people thought, oh, you know, we're just going to get enlightened instantly, and, you know, Dharma's going to cure all of our psychological problems. And then at a certain point, people, you know, that wasn't happening. And then all these people got so interested in Western psychology. Yeah, and it was just all the Buddhist magazines were just filled with articles about psychology and this and that. And you can tell that all these people were spending a whole lot of time studying psychology. And you know, and not so much the Dharma anymore. And I think that maybe part of that came because people, when they were practicing the Dharma, part of their motivation was to deal with their psychological issues. It wasn't necessarily to become liberated, you know. And I personally think that if you really learn the Dharma very deeply, you've got to deal with your psychological issues, you know. But there are ways in which people can practice and not deal with them and skip over them. And then whammo, they come up and, you know, smack the person in their face. And they thought they were really getting somewhere on the Dharma path. And then it's like falling apart psychologically. Yeah, so I think that kind of thing happened, you know, because there were people who were blocking out. Instead of using mindfulness or using thought training or whatever to look at our mind, they were using it to block out things. Okay? And so then, yeah. So I think, you know, if you all of a sudden like drop Buddhism and you're just so involved in psychology or something like that, or you're so interested in the Buddhist science dialogue that you're reading all these neuroscience books because, wow, you know, maybe my anger just is this is it's my synapses, and this is really explaining how I get angry because this synapse is connecting, this dendrite is connecting to this, axial, and it's shooting this chemical, and that's happening. That makes so much more sense than because I have wrong views, Yeah, and so just getting so interested in how this works, and then if we can just develop the correct pill that so that my dendrites and axials do what they're supposed to be doing, then I'll get there. Yeah, and so that that becomes your main topic of interest instead of learning the Dharma. Okay, so that's what this precept has to do with. Okay. Did I read that? Yeah. I think rather than go on to the next one, if you have any other questions? Yeah.
You might be a little bit of tangent, but I was kind of wondering about when Guy was here and you were talking about today with, seems to me like a lot of the things you talked about was like a Buddhalogist kind of approach. And it talks about the history, and it depended upon when these scriptures showed up.
Mm-hmm.
I have in my mind that there were, that if the Buddha taught me when he was here, that there were people just practicing this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a conflict there in my mind about how a lot of the thought, the Western scholarship around this
Mm-hmm.
kind of categorizes and thinks about the history and I don't know even how they put the whole thing together. It seems like it doesn't take into account that there were just practitioners, and the lineages of practitioners
Mm-hmm.
who didn't write, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're...
I can't even almost formulate the question well.
Yeah.
It just was like this sense of it felt like we're missing a piece here.
Who's missing a piece?
When you try to do the scholarship just by, this text showed up then, so this couldn't have happened, and
Right,
it
okay.
kind of loses the whole oral history and the whole level of individual practitioners who had these same words of the Buddha that later commentaries interpreted in certain ways, but maybe they didn't.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there's a difference between how practitioners view the history of Buddhism, or at least how the traditions view the history, and how Western or academic scholars view it, from who aren't practitioners, and that when you view it from a Western scholarship viewpoint, it has a very different flavor in it, and that's very true because the Western scholars, they can't take into account rebirth. They can't take into account, these more mystical things that happen because they're in a Western university where you're only supposed to talk about what you can see and hear with your senses. So all of that part of the teaching, like the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras being taught on Vulture's Peak, they're going to go to Vulture's Peak and say, well, that many people can't fit here, so that teaching just wasn't taught here. Yeah. And so, because they're looking at things through that perspective of it's only real if I can see it and with my senses, and not taking into account that there's a lot of things that we can't contact with our senses, that our senses are very limited, and that even animal senses can see many things that we human beings can't. Maybe an eagle could see all those beings squished into, I mean, you watch, even the cats, you watch the cats, you can tell they're seeing things that we're not seeing. Yeah? So our senses are quite limited. But in a Western university, you have to toe that line because that's the perspective. Also in a Western university, to be quote, quote, objective means you're supposed to criticize. And if you can't criticize, you're not being objective. So, I know for some friends I have who have a great deal of faith in the Dharma and they're also in Western universities, that brings them some really uncomfortable feelings because they don't want to criticize the tradition just because that's what academia requires. Yeah. On the other hand, then you go to people who just say, well, let's just learn how the tradition presents it. And I, personally speaking, I feel like I've gained a tremendous amount by studying Buddhist history, because then I can see how things that were going on in society influenced the development of Buddhism. Because from the traditional viewpoint, it's like, well, Buddhism is not influenced by culture or economics or politics or climate or anything. It's just pure Dharma. But when you really study the history, then you see, well, why does this tradition emphasize this? Well, this is the thing that was going on in the society at the time. And this is what the people were doing. And so this kind of teaching, really helped them deal with the situation they were facing in society at that time. So it helps me understand more the different traditions, to have that historical perspective. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
The scholastic approach just has doubt built into it. That's part of that full skeptical objective view.
Mm-hmm.
So for a practitioner with doubt issues, that may not be a place to hang out.
Yeah.
In the areas that until it was like have conviction.
Mm-hmm.
It does. It has the whole perspective.
Yeah. So whether you're studying Western history or Western science, if you have a lot of doubt issues, it can, really push those buttons. Yeah? Yeah.
My other question is more specific.
Uh-huh.
The four distortions are in the Pali Canon.
Yeah.
But they're also, are they in the long room?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So they made it into the canon.
Well, into the Lam Rim.
The long room.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Or into the Sanskrit.
Yeah. They're in there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my question is kind of tagging on to this, like when like Mama Sankata went and tried to pull all this together, were these kind of traditions like Pali and Mahayana even existing? I don't understand how it would even fit. Wasn't it just different countries and people coming from India, bringing all
Yeah. Well, this was one of the big challenges when Buddhism went from India to other countries, is that in India, and certain places in India, you had the early sutras that were quite popular in all the different locales. Now in Sri Lanka, you did get some Mahayana influence, but at a certain point, they stopped that. But when Buddhism went into China, for example, there's a whole section in the Chinese canon called the Agamas that is so identical to 4 of the five Nikayas in the Pali canon. So it really shows, because Buddhism went into China much earlier than it went into Tibet. So all those sutras were really around and really popular. They all went into China. Maybe they weren't translated from Pali, but they may have been translated from a Central Asian language or from Sanskrit or Prakrit or, what's it called, the name of the language? I can't remember them. But, some of these other languages, Brahmini, Brahmini's the script. Anyway, from some of the other languages. And also Buddhism went into China at the Mahayana was coming more public, so those scriptures went in. But Tantra wasn't very popular in India in the early years when Buddhism was going into China. In later years it was. But already they had, so many of the early sutras and the Mahayana, and then the Tantra just didn't jive so well with the mentality of the people in China. And also not so many Tantras went in because Tantra didn't become so pervasive in India until a long time after Buddhism started going into China. Whereas when Buddhism was going into Tibet, that's the heyday of Nalanda University. And so, Mahayana was very popular, Tantra was very popular.
So this is exactly that thing that
Right.
go this way here
And this way there. Yeah. Yeah.
But would there have been a sense of this higher, lower?
Well, this was a challenge to both in both China and Tibet, is they received so many different scriptures, not only sutras, but also different commentaries and different treatises, and sometimes they didn't say the same thing. Yeah, and so how do you take this whole array of teachings and make it into a system that makes sense? Well, one of the ways the Tibetans did it was in the late years of Buddhism in India, maybe like 8th, 9th, 10th century, already at that time they were talking a little bit more about different philosophical schools. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. It was mentioned in some Indian texts. But when Buddhism came into Tibet, they really started formulating a lot of these scriptures, classifying them according to the 4 philosophical tenets, because that's how they could make sense of all these different things that were saying different things, all these different scriptures that were saying different things. Okay. When Buddhism went into China, it went into China earlier, before they had so much talk about the tenet systems, but the Chinese masters started categorizing things according to the levels of the Mahayana scriptures. And so different masters, between the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Lotus Sutra and the Prajnaparamita, and then they would start, because some of these talk more about Chittamadra tenets, some more Madhyamaka tenets, and so on. Then they started classifying those according to different sutras, in a different system, and say, oh, first you should study this sutra, then this one, then this one. But of course they would say different things according to whichever thing they thought was higher. Yeah? But it was just the natural human way. If you get so much material, how do you put it all together to make it make sense without being contradictory? Okay? Yeah. So in Sri Lanka, they did it by just going to the very orthodox Pali tradition and kicking everything else out at a certain point. One of the kings said, I'm backing the Mahavira interpretation, and we're sticking by this. And so, some of the monks who were in the Abhayagiri monastery, where they had a lot of Mahayana influence, they were told either you become Mahavira monks or you become lay people. So that's how they dealt with it. Yeah. And then, so it got dealt with in different ways. Yeah.
Abhidharma also to try to organize all the different teachings?
The Abhidharma, came first, but it was an attempt to organize all these different teachings, but more in terms of the Buddha talked about different topics and to show the relationships between the topics. Not so much the path part, but it was the relationships between the different topics. Yeah.